Thanks. So yeah, I'm Buchanan. I'm from BAE, and I'm going to talk about intelligence-led pen testing, but in specific, the use of reversed malware in live pen tests. So one of the challenges that spawned the CBEST program and STAR was that we were being asked to make things seem more real, to look more like attackers and less like pen testers. Pen testers have their own idea of what attacks are like, and we use our own tools and our own techniques each time. And really what we're doing is attacking as ourselves, not as another person. So here came the threat intelligence requirement of CBEST. So yeah, the core message is that we need to replicate attackers, not just do our own attacks. And it's sort of the reverse of what we've been doing in the pen testing team for quite a long time. We've had tools created for testing purposes getting reused by malicious attackers in the wild, but what we want to do is use the tools that malicious attackers have made for themselves and repurpose them for testing. However, being the risk-averse types that we are, we had to consider potential pitfalls, et cetera, et cetera. What are the technical issues, whether this is actually going to be useful, and whether this is legal issues, whether we could be breaking the law. I don't want a malware developer knocking on my door saying, hey, you owe me money for using my kit without my permission. And what are the safety issues? Could we actually compromise our client security? So I'm going to go all the way through the issues with that. Ordinarily, I'd have Adrian Nish, the famed threat intelligence master, with me to do the threat intelligence side of things. And I'm a layman at best at threat intelligence, but unfortunately, he's somewhere exotic right now doing something far more interesting, as usual. So it's going to be me. Before I get into talking about the malware that we've got, one of the questions I had previously, and I kind of want to frame the talk with this because it was pretty fair, was most of this just sounds like buzzwords. It's star testing or red teaming from yesteryear, and what we've done is repackaged it and relabel it. And that is a fair question. It was a bit of a brutal question from CrestCon, and it threw me a loop, but it's legit. And what I'd like to say is that it's very similar to red teaming. We use very similar techniques, but we refine them. We're much more restrained, and we try to mimic attacker behavior rather than saying, I'm a pen tester, I know how to do red teams, and so I do the red team that way. I think that's the big difference, so just put that in mind. Cool, so threat intelligence side of things. Adrian will tell you that over the past couple of decades, the cyber threat landscape has evolved quite considerably. Back in the 1990s, when he was testing and I was not, the sort of threats that concerned people were the kind of lone hacker breaking into systems, the Kevin Mitnick and people like that doing phreaking and earlier. They were the hobbyists who occasionally made money through sort of winning phone competitions and cars and things like that, but it wasn't really a big financial gain for them. And their attack vectors were what we would describe now as the front door. So defending against them was reasonably straightforward, making passwords more complex, moving away from 3-character passwords, that kind of thing, putting firewalls in and improving standard stuff. And then over the turn of the millennium, we entered what Adrian has referred to as the virus era. He's got some very grandiose terms. Computer viruses did exist before 2000, but two things changed around this time. There was a huge increase in connectivity thanks to the internet and expansion of features in Windows PCs and servers to exploit. So yeah, we started having the big name viruses coming out. It started to become more of a market to make malicious code and release it into the wild, not just for fun. The virus era apparently ends at around 2006, but this isn't the end of the story. What happened was the coders found themselves being recruited into the offensive security market by criminal groups, but also by nation states and other people. And we started seeing more and more well-developed malware. And this is when we start getting interested in saying, hey, okay, this isn't just I exploit a vulnerability, I get a shell, and then I exfiltrate to another place. It starts being sophisticated, it starts being interesting, and we start going, okay, these are proper 0 days. Let's start reversing them and turning them into exploit code for our kit. And then what we're in now is more the professional era, nation-state attacks, and obviously they're not all highly sophisticated. We've seen the comment crew, and they're very basic attacks and that kind of thing. And I don't really want to use the term APT, but I think that's probably how most people feel about where we are now. But I think this audience understands the challenges in keeping out a determined adversary using a bespoke toolkit over a long time period. So let's look at some of the stuff that we've found. So we're going to I'm going to go through some real examples that we've seen recently, and they're kind of aligned to the basic attack model of star assessment or red team. So infiltration, evasion after getting a foothold, and then establishing a command and control channel to move data backwards and forwards and send commands. So let's look at the, The first one we're going to talk about is a watering hole attack, and it's by far the most common technique that we've had now. It used to be email and web compromise, but it's now more specifically a watering hole attack. Whilst email is still very popular with actors using legitimate services to trick users, we've witnessed a big rise in the watering hole style of attack over recent years. And you can see, I mean, there's no dates on that because Adrian doesn't like to make firm statements. It's easier for me if you laugh when I make jokes. It makes it much easier. So basically, the tactic behind watering hole attacks, and this is a much more technical crowd than I've previously presented to, so I'm just going to skimp on this bit, but it's basically you compromise a site that you know a user's going to use, you put some exploit code on there, and it redirects you to somewhere that you can put some proper exploit code, or you just exploit them on site. So an attacker interested in compromising a government agency would place their malicious code on sites such as embassies, think tanks, researchers, and technology websites. Think tanks specifically have been known for, or been seen by us to be exploited regularly. So yeah, they do this technically by creating an iframe link on the target website, this specific example that we've seen, often a single line of code just to force the browser to load external content. Often as well, it does checking at this point to make sure that the target's going to be vulnerable, otherwise it just leaves you on the normal site. Yeah, so then our attacker on the other end has some malicious code that they've hosted. The iframe redirects you to it, and they hack it. Oh, it used to be animated. It's not animated anymore. I'm sorry. Some attackers are now adding IP whitelists into their watering holes to ensure that a very narrow set of targets, like the high-value ones, the government agencies, and so on and so forth, so they get compromised. So us, the hobbyists, the people who like to go and hunt these things and kick them in the teeth, aren't actually going to go to the place where the payload is hosted, so we won't see it. This is a bit more sophisticated, targeted attack, and we see these things and we go, okay, are we still looking at a group of individuals who are just motivated by ideology or by mainly financial gain or possibly just a bit of fun? Or are we actually looking at someone now who's saying, right, I'm going after this government and so on and so forth? I'm going to avoid using specific country names because I have a contract of my head that says I can't use real names. So this doesn't require any 0 days, and it's just cleverly crafted social engineering to run something that they don't realize is actually malware. Oh, it is animated. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of doing a watering hole attack, but I think that's kind of basic. What I really want to talk about later is the pros and cons of using somebody else's watering hole attack. Let's move on. Cool, so DLL side loading. We saw an attack and we were asked to come and respond to attack in the energy sector in 2014. There were 3 files that were dropped, and they were sideloaded by antivirus, which was pretty cool. That zlh.exe is a legitimately signed binary. The DLL was the only bit that was different, and it loaded the there we go. And it loaded the data from a .dat file. So as far as the system was concerned, that's a legitimate file loading an illegitimate DLL, but because there's no restrictions on DLLs that are being run, it ran absolutely fine. And it ran our data, or the malicious user's data, and it caused some big problems. There we go. Xander's little helper, ZLH, I think, is what we've called it. I'm not entirely sure of the country of origin of this product. But there you are. I don't know. There we go. It's a signed binary. It isn't malicious, and .dat is encrypted. It took us ages to go through it, and yeah, it cannot be addressed directly in Windows without breaking expected functionality. Instead, it requires developers to ensure they code secure library loads, aka that's not my problem. And finally, the last thing we're going to talk about is command and control, and doing it through JPEGs. Now, yeah, I'll talk about some anecdotes around this later because this is kind of a basic attack that I've seen quite a few times, and I think most people can see it as being a standard method of doing things. But we were going after one specific group, and they were using legitimate content on compromised websites to hide what they were doing. But one of the obvious ones, one of the things we were doing a lot was JPEG files. There we go. So yeah, covert espionage actors, and they could update this in real time. So we were seeing the website, watching it over time, and seeing these pictures change and nothing else change. So we pulled down the JPEGs, and God, this is Adrian's slides. So yeah, basically it ran commands and would exfiltrate data through the JPEG and then get its new command from the next JPEG and pull it down. The malware itself was just like a standard exe. It wasn't that impressive. But this was just kind of an entertaining way, like a diversionary way of doing things that was a bit more distracting than what we'd usually see. There we go. Arrows. Cool. So yeah, this is a redacted URL from the campaign we saw. I was going to take this out, but it's a US politician who runs his campaign from this website. We'll just call it Jim's website. But yeah, there was a contact button. It was really basic. It was small in the corner. I think it just said something like go. And inside that, they were providing the encrypted data that they'd exfiltrated. So there we are. You look at it in hex here. The highlighted bytes there denote the end of file delimiter for a JPEG. So what's the rest of that afterwards? I don't hear you ask, but you would ask if we were having a one-to-one. The renderer will read down the bytes until it hits this pair of bytes and then display the image, and then after that, it would just do nothing. So this is where they were hiding their code. So we perform basic bit flip, it turns it into ASCII, and it looks like base64, but it's also a symbol Visionaire, however you pronounce that, cipher on top of it. This is a real example, and it just returns an ID from the command, but a standard Windows command. There we go. So that's the code we had there to reverse it. It's pretty basic. And there we are. So it sent the command, and that's the name of the machine there. Don't go Googling that. You won't find anything, I promise you. Cool. And yeah, there's another example. That basically, that's what it looks like once you reverse it in Midway. So when we run the malware executable, it now talks. So what we did was converted it so it would talk to our server rather than their original one. And since we knew the algorithm it was running, we just started sending commands to it to see what it was going through. And we worked out a way of basically using it for ourselves, running it on our own servers and so on and so forth. And these are all examples from the cases that our threat intelligence team, have done incident response for and also hunted down over time. And the actors behind them aren't always elite super hackers or whatever, but they've spent effort creating capabilities that will compromise and remain undetected on most enterprise networks. We can certainly both tune penetration testing to map their capabilities closer, but also gain inspiration from their techniques or even potentially repurpose the tools that they've created. Whew. Right, that's all the threat intelligence stuff done. That's the stuff I know nothing about, which is great. Cool. So yeah, practical considerations. Whether we can actually use these tools that we've found in the wild, and whether we should just draw inspiration from them, whether we can actually reverse them, change the IP addresses to our own ones, is what I want to talk about, and I think that's what the important thing is there. So let's talk about that watering hole attack, one of the primary compromise methods we've seen. Delivering a watering hole attack makes sense for a majority of for companies doing pen testing because it's a broadly applicable tool. The issue lies, however, in delivery. So, I mean, let's look at it from a practical consideration. If we're doing a pen test on a specific organization, unless we comp one of their websites that they're using, maybe a web portal or an externally exposed homepage that users are likely to be using, it's not going to work, right? Because we can't just compromise arbitrary sites, that's out of scope. So we now need to then contact them, saying, oh, hey, do you mind if we contact your third party? And then we need to include them in the contract, and it becomes more and more complicated. So that's a bit of an issue of using watering hole attacks, unless you want to come up with some fancy way of doing things. And so a solution to do this would be tying it with a phishing attack and domain squatting, typo squatting kind of attack. But then we're moving away from a pure watering hole attack, which an attacker would actually use. So we're having to adapt the attack that we want to replicate because we're incapable of doing it within contract limitations. So it doesn't really work. However, it does straddle both a user and attack and a browser security attack. So it's social engineering, but you can also use it to attack a browser. So we're doing multiple things there. Yeah, it's not ideal. And the biggest drawback of this is collateral damage, because even though we can whitelist IP addresses, we don't know that those people that we're attacking are within scope. And generally speaking, we attempt as pen testers to avoid attacking users directly. It's difficult to repudiate in those situations, and you can often end up in, as I said, collateral damage, or attacking third parties or in-scope employees when they're on their own systems at home. So it's not a controllable thing. However, we took one of the tools to a certain point where we could use it ourselves, and this is the command screen of it. It's pretty cool. It was PHP, so it was like trivial to reverse, and it redirected everything back to our code within a very short period of time. And you can run it from any available web page. It comes with a broad range of functionality. Unfortunately, as I said, using this in anger, using this in a pen test is quite difficult. And the biggest problem we have here as well is it looks exactly like a real attacker because it belongs to a real attacker. So when we see something from Metasploit or something like that, a Meterpreter shell running on a system, and they report it to the CISO, and they go, oh yeah, that's fine, it's likely to be the pen testers. When they see something that looks this dodgy, if they do, and report it back, it's actually, are they going to take that step to go, oh, maybe I should call the pen testing company, or immediately go, that's probably not them, that doesn't look like an established tool, let's call the police. It's not something to write off entirely, but it's difficult to implement correctly or effectively in a test, though as a source of inspiration to design better implants and explore alternative methods of exploiting a malicious file upload vulnerability, for example, it's perfect. And dropping the shell, but perhaps doing some sort of PHP functionality and messing around with it might be a bit better than dropping this kind of thing. So the DLL sideloading, replicating this style of attack yourself, given that as far as I'm aware, the actual code for this style of attack isn't in a commercial product at the moment. I'm reasonably sure that's the case. It's definitely not in Cobalt Strike or your standard Metasploit. We would want to use the code that we've taken and reversed instead of trying to build it ourselves, which takes a long period of time, or attempting to find some alternative, some corporate alternative that would do it. It works pretty well, though, and evades antivirus. Excuse me. It evades host defense evasion, antivirus, and app whitelisting, so it's very good, and it will go through where Meterpreter won't. However, can we trust it? And on the negative side, if we want to reuse the 3-file technique, we need to reverse the DLL, we need to reverse the EXE to work out how that's calling across, and then we also need to decrypt the DAT to make sure it all matches. And the chances of us getting it wrong first time, second time, third time increase. It's not a straightforward activity. And if we are to get around a well-implemented application whitelisting on a target system, then we need to understand which applications are available on that system prior to doing the test. And at that point, if we already know that, then why are we doing this attack in the first place? This technique is well known in the pen testing community. DLL sideloading has been around for ages. Last time we did this talk, somebody came up to us afterwards and said, oh yeah, I saw that in the 90s. Are we still talking about that? And I was like, yeah, we definitely are. Gives us something to do. So the JPEG stego, the back and forwards, a friend of mine from the community who shall remain unnamed was pleased for himself a few weeks ago for putting together an impressive PNG stego C2 channel, and it was pretty cool. Unfortunately, when I told him that we reversed one about 6 months ago, that it was and ours worked much better, he was a bit upset about it, and he didn't shed tears, but But the great thing about it is that the code is really straightforward. Hiding data in PNGs is something we've been doing for ages, and making it look like memes in the case of this one, or standard upload buttons, contact buttons, really basic forward stuff. It's trivial. And using your own methods of doing things to do C2 channels during a pen test shows to your client that you can come up with inventive ways of doing things, but it also evades, it also moves away from the standard attacker, right? So if we're using the one that we've got, it's assigned, or not assigned binary, but it's a recognized binary by antivirus. Everybody understands and sees that, has seen that attack. When we go and build our own one in Python, or go and build our own one in Bash, or PowerShell, suddenly we've gone around that, and maybe we're predicting what's going to happen in the future, but we're certainly not replicating the attacks that there are around now, which is the whole point. So yeah, as I said before, building something like this is pretty straightforward. Why would you use a dodgy sourced one instead of your own? And if we're aiming at SOC and mitigation-focused pen tests, then we need to make sure that we're replicating the attack in itself, not just replicating something that we know is going to go through antivirus because no one's ever seen it before. Yeah. So yeah, we picked this because it was something we'd seen recently, and it was from one of the infamous APT groups, which was attributed publicly to a government in the Far East last year. And there's a lot of case history available that can be used to gain buy-in from customers, which is what we're looking for, because we want to make sure it's real, and other attack vectors, other network defense teams face, we want to replicate all of those. And it has the benefit of being HTTP-based, which means it's really straightforward, and often people or SOCs aren't tracking in detail HTTP-based traffic. And it's hard for IDS and IPS to identify because it just looks like normal images, and if you don't do what our intern did, which was just make an image which had the hex of putty.exe in it, and tried to just put that straight through and didn't understand why just putting headers and footers of PNG file, and I didn't get it through AV. Yeah. But on the con side of things, even though the binary hashes may change, it could still get picked up by AV if we use this real one. And there's further risk here that the malware is associated with the known high-profile threat groups, though it could attract additional attention if uploaded to an online malware analysis site by the network defense team, which is standard practice. And we don't want four-letter agencies suddenly jumping on us and saying, or suddenly jumping on the case and saying, okay, this is attributed to a government in the East, and why is this suddenly up on this network? We need to go and investigate this, and it could be a very career-limiting conversation to explain to somebody why we're using their tools and why it's turned up here. Cool. So. Yeah, whilst falling out of favor with the security research community for misleading people into thinking they've seen a threat actor, APT style, attacking an organization is pretty bad, it's probably not as bad as causing a national security incident. And we could do this, as some code is attributed back to foreign intelligence services, and it shows up on the networks of commercial organizations in the UK. And if this is a CNI company, as we're working with a lot, it could get escalated quickly. But I think just as important is that do we fully understand the malware that we're trying to use in these tests? Have we fully reversed it? And if we go and use it in a live attack, I mean, we're obviously liable for the kit that we use. And whilst we have world-class reverse engineers who can pick apart malicious code like, before they have their breakfast, there's always the possibility that some low-level functionality exists which may produce unexpected behavior, and we could actually backdoor our customer's environment. If you think about how we were getting malware through Bouncer on the Google Play Store and that kind of stuff, and you just leave it for a certain period of time and Bouncer wouldn't pick it up because it only watched it for a short period of time, it's the same kind of thing. We can only watch malicious code for so long before it becomes a waste of time. If we're using the code from 6 months ago, yeah, okay, that's pretty reasonable, but if it's a year, 2 years, and I mean, it is reasonably far-fetched to think that a malware has a command and control channel built into it that will only kick off after 2 years, but honestly, I don't know. I can't say in earnest that there is no functionality on here that I have not detected, and therefore, I'm worried about using it. And another issue worth considering is if we use malicious tools for pen tests, the malware that we've reversed and we've put into our own toolkits, we probably won't want to release that out to the community. We'd want to keep it to ourselves to give ourselves an edge in doing pen tests. And I think one of the best things about the InfoSec community is the openness and people talking to each other and the organizations that put out the white papers and say, here's the code, here's how you exploit it, this is the way you mitigate it, and use that to improve things. I think this could reduce collaboration by us attempting to use those binaries and then go up to the companies when we're bidding on CBEST engagements and things like that and saying, we have 3 0 days that no one's seen. They replicate your attacker, and we're not going to release them until we've used them on your system. That's quite bad. Yeah, and finally out there, I hinted about this earlier, it'd be interesting to see if we do start doing this, whether a hacker could claim intellectual property rights over a piece of code they've created and used maliciously. I mean, they're already in prison. They could pretty much make any case they want to at that point. And it's self-incriminating to admit it, but if they're working for the government at that point or legally covered to build and deploy the malware, then we could get into a new uncharted territory for international law, and BAE's lawyers would go nuts. So in summary, we discussed the premise behind intelligence pen testing, looking at using malware in pen tests. We talked about what is being targeted, how it's being targeted, and why. And the latter isn't important for the traditional IT or network defense team, but it is important for the business to understand why people are attacking them and whether they should change their behavior rather than change their security. There is a lot to be learned from threat intelligence, and I'm really happy about the CBEST scheme coming forward and the advancements in those fields. Generic techniques attackers are using, but potentially also looking deeper at some of the specific cases and tools recovered and reverse engineered. Adrian's team track over like 100 threat actors using capabilities similar to what they said or what I said earlier. So there's a lot to be learned from those people, and closer work with them could be better. And yeah, I've spoken about the practical and ethical considerations of using malicious code in pen testing. Ultimately, we're not going to say whether you should or you shouldn't, but I think it's something that we need to have more discussion of because we are pulling code out of malicious binaries. We are replicating them, And honestly, can you look at the security tools that you use and say that you put it in anywhere near the amount of due diligence into those than people do into malware? My reverse engineers will spend ages and ages and ages going over a piece of malware. Whilst we do review the kit that we use, I think the weight is definitely in favor of the reverse engineers for how much time they spend on one specific binary, and I understand those way better than I understand some of the kit that we use. So yeah, there are practical advantages, but there's significant risk matters, and my presentation today was more about getting the discussion going rather than advocating particular approaches, so don't shoot me. Yeah, and some significant ethical and legal issues exist. Cool, that's the end of the talk. I'm happy to take any questions. I got some really brutal questions last time, so if you can beat that, I'll be really happy.